That's the silence that swallowed the Atlantic Security Forum on the night Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez dropped her pen. She wasn't reaching for it. That's what made it the moment. She wasn't fumbling or shifting or gesturing. She had simply been gripping it so hard, for so long, that when her concentration finally cracked, her fingers gave out. The pen slipped, it hit the stage floor, and bounced once, a tiny bright plastic sound that the microphones caught and broadcast into every living room in the country. And she did not pick it up. She sat there and looked at it, and in that silence between the moment the pen struck the floor and the moment the moderator finally spoke, something that had been building for the better part of an hour became permanent. She had walked onto that stage as the woman who lived at the microphone. She walked off of it as the woman who couldn't answer a fifth-grade geography question. This is the story of how that happened, and more importantly, why. You have to start 45 minutes earlier to understand what you just witnessed, because the pen wasn't the story. The pen was just the punctuation. The night had started with the kind of tension that fills event halls when the organizers have done something deliberate. 3 TV networks had cameras stacked along the back wall. The aisles were standing room. Word had gotten out that whoever put this event together had placed these 2 specific people on the same panel on purpose. And the crowd that showed up understood that this wasn't going to be a policy conversation. Policy was just the arena. The actual contest was something older and simpler. Who belongs in the room? Ocasio-Cortez understood this perfectly. She has always understood rooms. That is not a small thing. The ability to read a crowd, to feel where the energy sits, to know which sentence to say and when to say it, and she had been doing it longer than most people give her credit for. She arrived that night with the confidence of someone who has never been outmaneuvered on a stage, and it showed in the way she took the microphone during opening remarks. She didn't wait to be invited. She just began. I want to be direct tonight because I think the people watching deserve directness more than they deserve performance, she said. And then she turned and looked at Vance with the kind of measured deliberateness that tells you the next sentence has been rehearsed, and she delivered it. She told the room she was looking at a man who had built his entire public identity on a book about growing up poor, that he had used that book as a boarding pass, traded the story of poverty for access to Yale, for a publishing contract, for a political career, and then for the second highest office in the country, that the uniform on the cover was a marketing prop, that the resume behind it was a brand campaign dressed up as a life. A sound moved through the hall. Not approval, exactly. Something more like recognition, the crowd registering that she had decided, tonight, to skip the pleasantries entirely. And then she kept going. She turned, in effect, to address the people she had just described as Vance's base, the men and women who listened to him on the radio between church and the hardware store, the families who didn't own passports, the communities that she seemed to be treating, in that moment, as proof of a limited worldview rather than as people with their own legitimate grip on reality. She told the room that those people deserved to hear the truth, that Vance was a monument to the past dressed up in a senator's suit, that he was here to make people feel better about a version of America that no longer existed and probably never did. She leaned back in her chair when she finished. She had the look of someone who just set a fire in a fireplace and knows the room is about to get warm. What she had actually done was announce to 3 cameras and a room of several hundred people that she considered a large portion of the American electorate to be beneath serious engagement. She had done it with a smile. She had done it on purpose, and she had done it 4 feet away from a man who grew up inside the exact communities she'd just dismissed. J.D. Vance did not react. That's the thing about people who have genuinely waited in hard rooms. They don't perform patience. They just have it. He sat with his hands on his knees and let her finish completely. He let the applause she was expecting fail to fully materialize on the right side of the hall. He let the scattered clapping peter out before it found any real momentum. And then he let the silence stretch a beat past comfortable, and then another beat past that, until people in the front row started glancing at each other. Then he leaned forward and thanked her. He said it like he meant it. He said that kind of honesty was rare, and he appreciated it. And the way he used the word honest, setting it down gently, letting it breathe, quietly suggested that what had come before it was something else. He said he wanted to take her up on one thing. She had called him clueless about the world. He said he was happy to leave that on the table and examine it. He said he was a slow learner from a slow place, and he would appreciate an education. And then, instead of swinging big, he asked something small. He mentioned Munich. the International Security Conference from the prior February. He walked her through it gently, almost admiringly, noting that she had been on a major stage alongside governors and ambassadors, that she had positioned herself as a serious voice on global affairs, that she had, by her own description on a live stream afterward, walked in ready. She confirmed it. She said she'd never entered a room she wasn't prepared for. He nodded. He said he was glad to have that on the record. And then, without lifting the index card that had been sitting face down on his knee since the beginning of the panel, he asked her a question about Venezuela. Specifically about which hemisphere Venezuela occupies. The laugh that came up from the middle of the room was involuntary. That's how you know it was real. Involuntary laughter doesn't start in one place and spread. It erupts in several spots simultaneously, like small fires catching from the same spark. A man near the center aisle covered his mouth. A reporter 2 rows back looked up from her notebook and immediately looked back down. The woman sitting next to her was less successful at containing herself. Venezuela is in the northern hemisphere. Caracas sits several thousand miles north of the equator. This is the kind of geographic fact that requires no expertise. It lives in the same mental file as knowing which ocean is on which coast or knowing that Canada is above the United States. You don't learn it, you absorb it. Ocasio-Cortez had stood on an international stage and placed it in the southern hemisphere, with cameras rolling, while representing herself as someone who understood the world well enough to lecture a Marine about it. She sat very still for a moment, and then she did what she has always done when the ground moves. She changed the terrain entirely. She pulled the microphone toward her, and the steel came back into her voice, and she looked directly at the cameras rather than at Vance, and she told the room what was actually happening. A working-class woman of color, she said, the daughter of an immigrant family, had just been publicly quizzed like a student by a man who had been handed everything: his degree, his book deal, his Senate seat, his vice presidency, by a network of powerful men who had been selecting people like him for positions like these for generations. She said every woman in public life knows this ritual. Wait for one mistake, one human slip, and then use it to collapse everything else she's ever done, because a mistake is allowed to define her in a way it would never be permitted to define a man. She said this wasn't about a map. It had never been about a map. It was about who gets to be considered intelligent in America, and who has always made that decision. Give her this. It was a real punch. It had the weight of something true behind it, not true about this moment, necessarily, but true in a broader sense, true in the way things that have happened many times feel true when someone finally names them. The hall shifted. The reporter's pen was moving fast again. A young woman in the 3rd row who had been laughing 15 seconds earlier was now staring at her own hands. The current was hers again, briefly, but hers, and then a man at the far end of the dais cleared his throat. He was a Democrat. He'd represented a steel district for years. His father had worked a factory floor. His mother had cleaned office buildings on the night shift. He had sat through the entire exchange with his large hands folded and his face turned toward the table. And when he finally spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of someone who has been waiting a long time to say one specific thing and has finally run out of patience. He said he was going to say something, and then he was going to go back to being quiet. He told Ocasio-Cortez that she needed to stop. Not because the observation about gender was wrong, not because systemic barriers weren't real, but because she was standing on a stage invoking the working class like a password, and the working people he came from, the ones who actually worked, had never once been asked by her what they needed. She spoke for them at fundraisers in rooms they couldn't afford to stand in. She used the phrase like a coat she put on for cameras and took off when the event was over. Some of us, he said, are that word. We don't get to wear it and remove it. What that moment did to the room cannot be overstated. Because the accusation about gender politics, the one that had almost worked, the one that had the reporter's pen flying, requires a specific set of conditions to land. It requires that the person across from you can be made to look like the aggressor. It requires that the crowd believes you are the one under attack. When the attack comes from your own side, none of that works. The young woman in the 3rd row picked her doubt back up and didn't put it back down again. You could feel it move through the hall the way temperature moves through a room when someone opens a door, not all at once but steadily, and then completely. The protection that had kept Ocasio-Cortez covered for years in moments exactly like this one had just been removed by a Democrat from a steel town who had no particular interest in helping J.D. Vance and didn't appear to care how it looked. Vance took a slow sip of water. He set the glass down quietly. He let the silence do another lap. Then he said he wanted to let it go. He said geography errors happen, that he had told donors he'd read a bill that wasn't even printed yet, and he was not here to end anyone's career over a misplaced country. He said he meant it, but she hadn't called him clueless about a map. She had called him clueless about the world. War, consequence. Power, what happens in the spaces between the conferences. And he had given her time to walk it back, and she hadn't. So he turned the index card over same conference. Same night in Munich. After the geography moment, a moderator asked the room's central question, the one that every major power on Earth had been waiting for an American leader to answer with clarity. The question was simple. If China moves on Taiwan, does the United States commit troops? Yes or no? He read her answer from the card, and he read it slowly. I think that this is such a, I think that this is of course a very long-standing policy of the United States. 5 times. 5 ums in 22 seconds. No answer. A 20-second stall, and then the observation that she hoped the question would never need a real response. Nobody laughed at that one. That one went somewhere deeper, into the part of a room that makes up its mind. She came back fast. She said it was a grotesque reduction of a nuanced position on the catastrophe of permanent American military adventurism. That caution is not the same as ignorance. That some people actually think before committing other people's children to war. She said senator instead of his actual title and immediately corrected herself. Vance caught it. He let it sit. And then the easy warmth that had been in his voice for the better part of an hour went flat. He said he was glad to talk about other people's children going to war, because on that particular subject, in that particular building, he was not the clueless one. He said he had gone to Iraq in 2005. He said he wasn't going to wave it around for points. He said the men he thought about on nights like this one couldn't run for anything, couldn't do live streams about how the questions were unfair. He wasn't going to give the room their names because they weren't props for a panel. But he said this much. When a leader with cameras on her freezes for 20 seconds on the most important question her generation has to answer, that hesitation is not an abstraction. It has mass. It travels. And somebody younger than both of them is the one who carries it in the places where the conferences don't reach. He had watched people carry it, he said. He had helped carry one of them. So when she told him her silence was the careful kind, the thoughtful kind, he needed her to understand who was listening when she said that. Because the conference room and the world are not the same room. They have never been the same room. And one of them keeps getting the two mixed up. Then came the part that Vance had been holding back all night. The card went flat on the table. He told the room that after Munich, the criticism had come, not from him, not from Republicans, but from Democratic strategists, from her own party's foreign policy apparatus. He had one quote written down. He read it, that she had shown a complete lack of chops on international issues, her own side. Not a paraphrase, a direct quote. He'd written it down, and then he described the live stream she'd posted in response. The explanation she'd offered for the 5 ums and the wrong hemisphere and the 20-second silence on Taiwan. She had said on that stream that the problem wasn't her understanding of the world. The problem was that America had gotten so used to a president who spoke without thinking that people had forgotten what it looked like when a leader paused to consider. She had been asked a question. She couldn't answer it. And when her own party said so, she told the country the question was their fault for expecting more. The hall broke, not a titter, not the contained polite laughter of people trying to stay professional. The full thing, the rolling, helpless building kind that takes a crowd over and doesn't give it back. The kind where people start laughing partly at the original thing and partly at each other, and it compounds. The man in the front row who had driven in from Ohio, the one with the leg that didn't come back whole from overseas, shook his head with a grin he could not have stopped at gunpoint. She had one swing left, and she made it count. She leaned in. She dropped her voice. And what came out was, for the first time all night, something genuinely felt rather than performed. She talked about the bar, the 10-hour shifts. Men like him being mentored at Yale by the exact architects of the world he was now lecturing her about. She told him he hadn't climbed out of anything. He'd been lifted by a hand that reaches down for young men who write the right kind of story about their own people and then leave those people behind. She said she had learned the country from the floor of it, not from a memoir about the floor, not from a documentary deal about the floor, from the actual floor. She was leaning forward and the heat was real, and for a moment, a genuine moment, the hall moved back toward her. The old electricity that she knows better than most how to generate. A pen or two stopped moving. And then Vance took the gloves off. He said no one on the stage was diminishing her life. He said she had built something real starting from behind a bar, and he would shake her hand for it in any parking lot in America. But that, he said, was not what was on the table tonight. What was on the table was simple. She had stood on the world stage and couldn't say which half of the planet a country was in. She couldn't answer the one question that every serious leader in every serious capital has to be able to answer. And when her own party called her out, she told the world it was their fault for asking. He set the index card down, face up in the space between them where the cameras could find it. She didn't run out of an answer that night in Munich, he said. She ran out of the humility to admit she never had one. That's the only thing on this stage that qualifies as clueless. And it isn't the Marine. 11 words. No insult, no name, no accusation, just her own words sitting next to her own record in a room with nowhere to go. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked down at the pen in her hand. The knuckle at the base of her thumb had been white for the better part of 60 seconds. Every camera in the hall had found it, the small total pressure of a person holding onto the one thing left to hold. She is a woman who has never found a room she couldn't talk her way out of. That is not a trivial skill. She built a career on the certainty that the next sentence would arrive, the way it always had, right when she needed it. And for the first time in front of the country, it didn't. The grip gave. The pen slipped. It hit the hardwood of the stage and bounced once, a bright, small, irreversible sound that the floor microphones caught and sent out across a hall. You could have heard a pin drop in. She did not reach for it. She folded her hands in her lap, and she said nothing at all. The clip was online before the hall finished emptying. By midnight, it had a name. People were calling it 20 seconds, a reference to the Taiwan stall, but what they were watching, on loop, was something shorter than that. The geography question, the Democratic congressman from the steel town, the card turning over. And the pen. Most people weren't arguing about it. That was the thing. There was no great debate about Taiwan, or military doctrine, or the nature of political experience. There was just a video of a woman calling a Marine clueless about the world, and then watching her try to name which hemisphere a country is in, while the Marine sat quietly 4 feet away. The broadcast used a still frame of the pen caught mid-bounce, an inch off the hardwood. Underneath it, in plain white letters, was the last line Vance had said. In the corridor outside, a reporter stopped a Democratic congressman who had endorsed her multiple times. He didn't want his name used. He looked both ways down the marble hallway first. Then he said, "Everybody saw this coming. We knew after Munich. We told ourselves it was nerves. It wasn't nerves. You can survive being wrong. You cannot survive being wrong and then telling the country the problem is theirs for noticing." He walked away before the recorder came all the way up. The man from Ohio drove home on the dark interstate. No radio, just the highway unspooling in the headlights. Somewhere past the state line, with no one to see it, he started laughing to himself at the memory of a pen bouncing on a stage and a Marine who had actually been to the world she kept calling herself an expert on. He kept driving. Back to a place that some of the people on that stage had decided was only a memory, back to a town that some voices in that building treated as proof of a limited imagination rather than the foundation of a real life. Vance slipped the index card back into his jacket pocket. He shook 2 hands and walked past the cameras calling his name, past the empty chair, past the pen still lying on the stage where nobody had picked it up. He'd come in with 1 card. He left with it. There's a version of this story that's about politics, about parties and policy, and the way power moves around a room. And sure, some of that is here. But underneath it, it's about something older. Something that doesn't really have a party. It's about the distance between talking about a place and knowing it. Between studying something and surviving it. Between the confidence that comes from never having been wrong in a room you controlled, and the steadiness that comes from having been in rooms you didn't. She flew over the world to talk about it, he walked through it, and on one stage on one night, with every camera in the building watching, the country got to sit with both of those things and decide which one looks like understanding. The pen is still on the floor.